Hey nerdy knitters, have you heard of the show Outlander, or maybe the book series? The show is super popular with knitters because some of the garments in the show are just really lovely, lovely hand knit garments. And you will find patterns and comments and so many people talking about the knitting in this show. But I have one question. Is the knitting in Outlander historically accurate? We're going to explore that question today. We're going to look at 5 areas that can give us some historical context for knitting during the 18th century, 5 things that people really did knit during that time, and 2 things that Outlander got wrong. Yes, they did get some things wrong. We still love the knitting, that's for sure. But it's not exactly historically accurate. But stick around because I have some recommendations for you. If you love the knitting in this show, then I've got some patterns and book recommendations for you. Now, we're looking at the mid-1700s, about 1740 to 1750. That's when our story takes place, what we would call the mid-18th century. And it's actually difficult to find hand-knit remnants and artifacts from that time period for 2 different reasons. Most people would have worn their things until they had to be patched and repaired until they were beyond use, and then they were probably still used after that for rags or stuffing or other things. And everything was made from natural fibers. You didn't have any acrylics or polyesters or chemical-based products back then. So everything was made from cotton and silk and linen and wool, and those are all natural things that decompose with time. So those 2 factors make it difficult to find historical artifacts from this time period. But there are some things that we can explore to see what was happening with garments and with knitting during that time. The first thing we can do is look at portraits and paintings and sketches because, of course, this is the pre-photography days, but there were people that were having their portraits done and there were sketches and things like that. The one thing here, though, is most of these were probably people in their Sunday best, not the things they wore every day. So it does give us some examples for what people were wearing, but it wouldn't have been everyday garments that people probably would have been wearing in Scotland in the mid-18th century. And we do have some historical artifacts from that time period. You can look at different museums online. I looked at a lot of English museums, the Victoria and Albert Museum and Scottish museums, and I found some different examples of fabrics and things. There's not many, but there are some. And that gives us some context for the type of knitting that people were doing at the time. We can also look at the tools because while the natural resources would have been degrading over time, the things that were tools, we still have copies of those today. The knitting needles at the time, they were called knitting pins. They were very fine wire, usually 1.25 to 2 millimeter, which is like a US 000 to a size 1. So we are talking thin wires, like sock needles and lace knitting needles. They're very thin. Now there were some slightly larger needles made from bone or wood, but those had a specific use. We'll get into that, but most of the knitting that people would have done would have been on these super fine knitting pins, and they would have used something called a knitting sheath or a belt, where you would stick one of those needles. These needles were like long double-pointed needles. You'd stick one of those ends into this sheath that was belted around your waist, and it would carry the weight of your work so you could knit, but you wouldn't have to hold everything in your hands the whole time. So if you've ever seen pictures of ladies carrying like peat on their backs in baskets and they've got their knitting belt on and their sheath and they're knitting at the same time, that gives you an example of something that would have been done even earlier. We can also look at inventions of the time. In 1589, a man invented something called the stocking machine, which was for knitting stockings. That was developed and processed over time, and it was still in use during this time period. And there's actually a sort of a legend that's developed around the creation of this machine. It's said that the man that invented it first made it to get revenge on a lover who had preferred to concentrate on her knitting rather than attend to him. I have no idea if that's historically accurate, but I still find it a funny story, especially since I'm a knitter. Now, besides all of these things, our tools and our machines and photographs and historical artifacts, there's one exciting thing that I thought really showed what knitting was like at the time, and that was the discovery of the Gunnister Man. 2 men were digging peat in 1951, and in the peat bog, they discovered a body, and it was later found that this body was from the 18th century. Now, the body is about 50 years before the story in Outlander takes place, but that gives us a good understanding of what knitting was actually happening. And while most of his bodily remains were gone, a lot of his clothing and the items he had with him were still there, and they were preserved in this peat bog, and he had lots of knitted items on his body. He had 5 different hand knit items on him. So let's take a look at each of those and we'll get an idea of what knitting was like through a real product of the time. He was wearing long stockings. These were knit at 7.5 stitches to the inch. They were patched and they were mended, and there's a decorative panel that runs along the back, and the increases and decreases were worked at the edges of this panel. And he also had gloves with him, and these were also patched and mended. These were 17 stitches to the inch, so we're talking really fine knitting here. And it was a mix of garter stitch and stockinette stitch with some textured purl stitch patterning in there too. And he had 2 caps with him, one in his pocket and one laying either around where his head was. One is about 8 stitches to the inch. One was 9 stitches to the inch and a bit felted, and they looked like they'd been used quite a lot as well. And the final item he had with him was a hand knit purse that was knit at 11.5 stitches to the inch. So another really fine knit item. And this one is really exciting because it shows an example of 2-color stranded knitting. So we're getting a peek at not just the textured in knitting, but also the stranded color work that would have come later on. So these 5 things can give us a clue of what knitting would have been like at the time. It most likely would have been very fine, done on very fine needles. We don't see evidence for really large, bulky knits and large needles. So I think you can see where I'm going with this, because some of the knits in the show are big, bulky knits, and there's really no evidence for that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I still want to cover a few more things. Let's look at what they would have really been knitting in the 18th century. First of all, the whole family would have been involved in knitting. It was important to clothe everybody, and they were making everything that they wore, so everybody had to pitch in and help out with that. But they could also barter and trade and sell the items that they knit, especially with the invention of the stocking frame, which was in Scotland as well. And people would invest in these, and then they could trade and sell the items that they made. As you can see from this quote right here, machine knitting soon spread to Scotland, and it was seen as the first serious venture into establishing framework knitting in Scotland, and this was in 1681. So less than 100 years from the time period in Outlander. And here's another quote about what was happening with trading and bartering and selling knitted items. They were exported overseas or traded with passing merchant vessels. For example, some in Shetland traded their knitwares with passing Dutch ships for resources including tea and sugar. In 1793, Aberdeen exported around 76,000 dozen pairs of hand-knitted stockings. This was primarily to the Netherlands. So at this point in history, we're less than 50 years after the events in the first few Outlander books, and we can see there's already an established knitting trade. So that leads us right to the very first thing that was often knit at the time, stockings. They were either machine knit with a stocking frame, or they were hand knit on very fine needles. And they would have used silk and cotton and even wool to make these stockings, and they would use them for themselves, but they would often trade and barter them as well. And they came in a variety of colors. Here's a quote that shows what some of the colors would have been. Black, white, and blue were common, with blue being a particularly common color among the working class. The gauge for these stockings varied from 5 or 6 stitches to the inch to 12 stitches to the inch, even up to 22 stitches to the inch for very fine stockings. And they would be begun with some garter stitch first, and then they would be worked in stockinette. Sometimes there would be lots of decorative panels on them. And for the stocking frames especially, they did some color work in there as well. Lots of variations for these. And then, of course, they were mid-thigh. We weren't talking shorty socks here. These were like mid-thigh socks. They were very long. And then they would be held up with garters, of course. And that garter edge around the top would help them stay up on your legs. Now, along with the industry of stocking making, we also have hat making. It was actually a law at one point that men had to wear hats all the time. And I'm not sure about this time period, but bonnet makers of the time, they were special guilds, only men of course, and they made these hats. And their needles were larger than the very fine needles. They would be bone or wood, and they would knit these hats about twice the size that they were meant to be, and then they would be felted. And these are what we would call today the Scotch bonnet. We would call it a beret or a tam. And these wool bonnets were, of course, waterproof, because this process made a really warm, waterproof hat that was great to wear. They could be made of cloth as well, but for everyday people, wool bonnets would have been the things that they wore at the time. And like we think of the Scottish tartans today that represent their heritage, the Scots blue bonnets in the 18th century was the quintessential Scots. Like people would know them exactly because of those tams or berets that they would wear that they would call bonnets at the time. Now, along with these two big industries, there were other things that people knit as well, as we could see with our example with the Gunnister Man. Gloves was one of those items. These could also be hand knit or machine knit, and they could be done with cotton and wool and silk, and it was usually done with very fine yarn and very fine needles. This is a pair of women's fingerless mitts, and you can see how very fine the stitching is on that. And another thing that was also knit on those very fine needles, generally with silk, were purses. Like the Gunnister Man, he had one that was some early examples of stranded colorwork. A lot of the ones that we see today were made of silk, but they probably would have been made of other fibers as well. Now, the last thing that we see that was hand knit sometimes are garments. There are three different types. For men, it would have been their undershirts. They would have called them waistcoats. They would have worn them underneath their linen shirts. Those could have been hand knit. And women would also wear sometimes what they would call hand knit jackets around their house, basically after they had a baby or something like that and they were just relaxing and resting at home. They would have worn this. And also there were infant jackets as well, which were similarly made as the women's jackets. Knit in white cotton, stockinette with reverse stockinette chevrons and moss stitch on the hem and cuffs. The front and back were knit in one piece and then they were bound off at the shoulders together. And then the sleeves were picked up at the shoulder and they're worked down to the wrist. Now that we've looked at these lists, you can probably already see the things that we see in Outlander that we don't have evidence for historically. First would be those bulky knits, that bulky cowl that is absolutely beautiful, but it's not something that would have been knit back then. They didn't have the needles that were the right size, for one thing. Everything that was done that was hand knit was usually on really thin needles and really fine gauge yarn. And the second thing we don't see, which I was really surprised about, were shawls. We don't see hand knit shawls. Now we look at the shawls in the show and they look so historical, like that's just something people would wear to keep warm. But actually they didn't wear them at this time. They will in about 50 years. During the 19th century, it becomes known as the shawl period because women wear shawls all the time. But we are about 50 years too early for that. So what were women wearing if they weren't wearing shawls to stay warm? They would have worn cloaks like men did, and these would have been woven probably in wool and then sort of a felted fabric, so they would be waterproof and warm. If you've ever worn anything like that, you know how warm it can be, and that would have been perfect for the environment. And along with cloaks, they would have worn tartans and plaids like men did as well. For women, they were called erisages. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but here's how it's spelled. But they would have worn this sort of like two skirts with a belt, and then they could pull one of the pieces up over their head to keep out the rain or the weather. So along with their cloaks and their plaids, if they didn't need so much coverage, they would wear something called a fichus, just a light linen or fabric square that they would have pinned around the bodice of their dress. And that would sort of give them some extra coverage up there or some warmth, depending on the fabric. And this is sort of a precursor to something that would come about 100 years in the future. The sontag, that shawl that is wrapped around and then sort of crossed and belted in the front. We see that in this show, but it's really a little bit too early for that kind of a shawl. I was really surprised by this fact. I thought shawls would have been something that they would commonly use and wear, but they didn't at this time. In about 50 years, they will. So while we love the beautiful shawls and the capes and the bulky cowls and the fingerless mitts that are knit on bigger needles, we can appreciate them, we can love them, but they're not historically accurate. But if you do love them and you're looking for some patterns or you want to knit some of these items for yourself, there are two books that are filled with some great patterns. This book here, Highland Knits, has 16 patterns. Many of the iconic pieces from the show, they've been recreated, reinterpreted, capelets, gauntlets, shawls, cowl, from the earlier seasons of the show. You'll find them all in this book, Highland Knitting. Now, a more recent publication, Outlander Knitting, has some of the more recent seasons of the show as well. And this one has 19 patterns, and they were inspired by the show and also some recreated favorites from the show. The capelet, the rent shawl, arm warmers. There's a Fair Isle tam and vest, and there's some pieces that were also inspired by the show itself. They're not directly from the show, like different socks and things like that. And this one also includes other information about the show itself and also some historical information. So if you love the knitting in the show and you want to recreate some of those items for yourself, then these two books are perfect for you, and you'll find links for them down below in the video description box. Now, if you'd like more videos like this, where we talk about Outlander or other TV shows or movies that feature lots of great hand knit items, leave me a comment, tell me about the show, and I'll check into it. And if you're interested in more historical knitting, take a look at this video right here where we look at the knitting in all creatures, great and small.